Today, we're continuing our series on poverty and inequality in the United States. Our speaker is one of the nation's leading authorities on the topic. Robert B. Reich, Secretary of Labor for Bill Clinton, and now a professor of public policy at the University of California, Berkeley. He's the author of 18 books, including The System, Who Rigged It, How to Fix It, and Saving Capitalism. If you're somebody who prefers his streaming, his work has been showcased in two recent documentaries, Inequality for All and Saving Capitalism, both worth checking out. Professor Reich, I want to thank you very much for taking the time to come talk with us and our reporters and other listeners today. So I'm going to turn the floor over to you. You're going to present some of the key findings from your research on poverty and inequality and your thoughts about what might happen to it. And then after that, I'll have some questions for you, and we'll go to questions from our audience. So I'll turn it over to you, but welcome.
Thank you very much, Chris. I assume you can hear me?
Yep, we hear you just fine.
Good. All right. Well, thank you very much. And again, thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the National Press Foundation for this opportunity. And I thought what I'd do, because this is such a huge topic and it is quite amorphous, but it also underlies almost every major issue we are dealing with, from COVID through the environment, through racial injustice. And I wanted to at least put on the table a lot of the major framing issues that makes all of this, that connects all of this. I've spent most of my life not only studying inequality, but also on the front lines trying to do something about it. And why don't we just simply start with some slides. I think the most important thing for us to acknowledge, and let me just start with this one here. If you can see it, just nod your head if you are with me. This is kind of the Economic Policy Institute's chart, but it's been replicated, and it's a pretty good place to begin. But it shows that productivity gains, and that is a pretty good proxy for economic growth, have continued on with some fits and starts all the way up to the present time. Obviously, we now have a COVID-related recession. But the most important point to see here is that in the late 1970s, some would say maybe mid or beginning 1970s, something happened. Because up until that time, hourly compensation rose in tandem with productivity gains or with the growth in the national income. And then it started to diverge. And we saw that hourly compensation, that is typical hourly compensation, median hourly compensation, started flattening out, while productivity gains, economic growth in general, continued. This is important. It's important to understand why this happened, because if we want to do anything about it, and public policy and much of the debate in Washington and in state capitals and elsewhere has to do with this, what to do about it. Why is this happening? Why has it happened? We also see that politics reflects a lot of this, and I'll get to that in a moment. You can't really understand what has happened to American politics, I don't believe, over much of the last 40 years, unless you understand why hourly compensation really did stop growing and the significance of all of that. You can see over a longer term that what we are now experiencing very much replicates what we as a nation experienced in the 1920s. Almost 100 years ago exactly, we see this blue line, that's the pre-tax income for the top 1%. This red line is the post-tax income for the top 1%. Well, both of them follow a kind of suspension bridge pattern. You see that here in the it really was between the late 50s and 1980. Some would say from the Second World War to 1980, you had a flattening of the top 1% pre-tax. In fact, the top 1% was taking home a very small amount of pre-tax and post-tax earnings. But then we reverted again to this kind of pattern, this kind of degree of inequality. I have written, and others have also pointed out, that when you have so much income in the hands of a relatively few number of people, relatively speaking, it is hard to keep the economy going in terms of demand, because the rich just simply do not have that many things to buy. Even if they tried to buy as much as they could, they tend to save, and their savings go all around the rest of the world. So you have a kind of macroeconomic demand issue here. And it's interesting, I suppose, to note that the biggest years, the highest years of really the top 1% carrying home most of the income, or a big chunk of the income, not most of it, but big chunk, occurred in 1928 and also in 2007. But we see the pattern continuing on. Also, it's important to see that the United States is unique. Now, other countries do follow the United States toward greater and greater inequality of income and wealth, but the United States is the outlier. It's very difficult to say, for example, that in the United States, we are simply experiencing the same macroeconomic and structural issues as the rest of the world in terms of trade and technology, imposing a lot of hardship on people who are less educated. There's something else going on here in the United States, because we really are so extreme. You can see here the United States at the top, and compared to other countries, even the United Kingdom and Canada, we really have the most extreme inequality in terms of total income. And you see this darker blue line since 1990, that degree of inequality has extended and enlarged dramatically since 1990 in the United States. The other point that needs to be made is, and has to do with racism. And there are many, many aspects. Obviously, we could spend hours and hours talking about this. In fact, I teach an entire course on this, but I wanted to point this out to you. This looks at wealth rather than income. Obviously, income is a flow, wealth is a stock. It reflects how much you've managed to save, or the form of your saving. The difference between white and Black and Latino wealth is huge. It's 10 times. Much of this has to do with the housing stock. Much of it has to do with the legacy of redlining, and before that, obviously, of slavery. But you see that that legacy has taken a very, very dramatic turn in the United States. Again, we can talk about this, and I'm hoping that we can, because again, Chris, I want to emphasize that all of these issues are related to every other issue. The pandemic has simply accentuated many of these divisions. The people who have lost their jobs and been most affected financially, also lost their lives, tend to be lower income people, also tend to be people of color. We did in this country have some quite substantial federal response in the CARES Act. And what you can see here is that although people lost a great deal of ground beginning in March, February and March, unemployment insurance and the one-time stimulus payments and other government payments did help out. And a lot of people, poor and lower income Americans, even middle income Americans, did save as much as they could of these payments. And that was both good for families, and it was also a stimulant to the economy. We didn't go as deeply into recession as we might otherwise have. But all of that ended, or some of it ended, July 31st, and the rest of it is going to end December 31st. And so there's a big question hanging over the economy and hanging over individuals, particularly the bottom half, what happens now? What happens? Well, a lot of people already are suffering in terms of those extra unemployment benefits, those $600 a week unemployment benefits having been ended on July 31st. The other point I want to mention is the relationship between what we now know about the 2020 election and inequality. Because there has been a big debate ever since the 2016 election about class and race and the election. To what extent did Donald Trump win in 2016 because of racism? Was it all about race, or was there something else going on? Well, I think what's helpful to see is that the information I'm going to get now illustrate for you has continued on even more dramatically between 2016 and 2020. We only have good data up to 2016, but the point is that there is a gap between non-college and college that is carried over into politics. I think, in my opinion, race is still obviously a huge factor, but the non-college versus college gap is playing a larger and larger role in American politics. And what you see here among non-college graduates is that white non-college graduates, if you compare what people were earning, let's say in 1989 to what they were earning in 2016, non-college graduates have actually dropped relative to where they were. The Hispanic and Black non-college graduates are doing a little bit better. And if you extrapolated this on the basis of what we know, all of these curves would just be extrapolated further before pandemic. But look at college graduates who are white have done remarkably well. College graduates who are Black have not particularly held their own. Obviously, they're doing much better than Black non-college graduates. Hispanics, particularly after the Wall Street financial crisis, have not done as well. But what I want to point you out is the non-college whites were the ones who actually took the biggest hit relative to where they were. And they continue to be, in my view, a very important and a constituency almost up for grabs. The Democratic Party is becoming more and more the party of college graduates. The Republican Party, particularly the Trump Republican Party, is becoming more and more the party of non-college graduates. You can see that here in terms of counties that voted for Joe Biden and those that voted for Trump. If you do an analysis county by county, you find that the Trump counties, more in 2020 even than in 2016, are counties where the median income is dropping or is barely holding up. But the Biden counties are counties where the median incomes are actually doing better, and they have more college graduates. I think what we see generally speaking in the United States is that coastal areas that are more and more democratic, capital D, are places where you have the leading edges of American industry, and the places that have lost big manufacturing, and places that are basically emptying out more and more, or growing older, and are certainly whiter, are places where the Republican Party is still very much holding on. And this is going to be with us for many, many years. Why don't I stop there? I hope I've laid the table. I put a bunch of issues on the table. Let me also hasten to say that many of the people who are watching, hopefully, are people who have already got deeply into many of these questions. Anna Wolf is a winner of your prize. And Anna, I've read your great features with regard to inequality and poverty. Thank you for those. Some of you are from RAND, and your report months ago on comparing really what happened to the median wage in the first 3 decades after the Second World War compared to what happened after that point in time is, I think, extraordinarily important and needs to have even more public attention paid to it. But again, let me stop there, Chris, and if you have questions, be delighted to respond.
The first is kind of the biggest and broadest one. Why does this matter? We have this, big spike in inequality over the last few decades. It's comparable to what was seen in the early part of last century. How does a country eventually have to? Does a country eventually have to deal with that, or do they? How long can it go if inequality is that high, or what will happen if it is?
Well, there are a number of costs to the degree of inequality we now have, Chris. One cost is upward mobility. The longer the ladder, that is the income ladder, the harder it is for somebody who is born in the bottom half to move up. And what we see, obviously, is that as that ladder has lengthened over the last 40 or 50 years, income mobility upward has also become harder for many, many people. If there are rungs missing in the center of that ladder, as the middle class starts shrinking, then that climb becomes, again, that much more difficult. That has, in turn, some consequences with regard to social, what might be called social solidarity, or a sense that we're all in the same boat together. People who are squeezed in the middle become less generous. They are more susceptible to demagogues who want to blame people who are at the bottom, who are either immigrants or Black or Latino or in some ways different. And you get a degree of susceptibility to demagoguery that I don't think you have when you have a very large middle class and everybody feels like they're on an upward escalator together. And finally, there is an issue with regard to political power, because it is impossible to separate great wealth from great power. As Justice Louis Brandeis, one of our greatest Supreme Court justices, said toward the end of the last Gilded Age, assuming we're now in the second Gilded Age, he said this toward the end of the last Gilded Age. He said, in America, we have a choice. Either we can have great wealth in the hands of a few, or we can have a democracy, but we can't have both. And I think what he was getting at is that it's not just simply a matter of bribery or corruption or even donations to campaigns. It's much deeper and broader than that. When you have a concentration of great wealth at the top, there's almost no way in which that money, that wealth, doesn't affect politics in some way, even public opinion. You look at the extent to which money is now attempting to drive public opinion, corporate influence campaigns, for example. We just lived through one here on the West Coast with regard to Lyft and Uber, and they're successful. They're very expensive, but very successful from their point of view, efforts to change the law so that they could have independent contractors rather than employees classified that way. Well, you see, that's another sort of symptom of the concentration of wealth and power.
Okay. Now you, in your book, we talked about it at the top. This is the book, The System. And in there you talk about coping mechanisms that the public has, and coping mechanisms that they had over the last 3 or 4 decades to kind of deal with their declining economic power. And I just want to share one graph from that. I'm hoping you could kind of talk about it a little bit more. Basically, to me, it seemed to sum up why the nation is in the foul mood that it's in right now. You write, Americans woke up, this is after the 2007-2009 recession. Americans woke up to the startling reality that they no longer could afford to live as they had been living, nor as they thought they should be living relative to the lavish lifestyles of those at the top, nor as they expected to be living given their continuing aspirations for a better life, nor as they assumed they could be living given how large the economy had grown, nor as they assumed they would be living given what they experienced in the 3 decades after World War II. I mean, does that kind of sense of unfulfilled expectations, does that explain both Bernie and Donald Trump?
Yes, I think it does. I think the most powerful force in American politics today, and to a lesser extent, but still a very important, powerful force in European politics and then the politics of other advanced nations, is anti-establishment anger. And that anger is related to a sense of unfulfilled expectations. You see this really in the United States, and I was there. I mean, I remember even when I was labor secretary in the 1990s, I would go out very often to the Rust Belt and to the South and to the Midwest. And people would say to me, I'm working harder than ever and I'm not getting ahead. Why is that? And they would be, it was not exactly anger in those days, but it was more of a sense of frustration. And women had flooded into the workforce, not because there were so many great opportunities for women, they flooded into the workforce mainly in order to prop up family incomes that were otherwise dropping. And then families were working all hours. I remember when I was labor secretary looking at the data in terms of just the number of hours Americans were putting in at families, much more hours than even the Japanese, and wondering how they could last. I mean, obviously there was a limit to how many hours they could put in. And then finally, in the early 2000s, many American families kind of held on to their expectations of rising incomes or rising living standards by turning their homes into piggy banks. You remember that, when everybody assumed that housing prices would rise. And then when the financial crisis set in 2008, I think a lot of people, not only did they run out of coping mechanisms, Chris, but they also ran out of patience. There was on the right, there was the Tea Party movement. On the left, there was the brief Occupy movement. But the direct lineal descendants of those two were Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders. And I think that that kind of left-wing populism and also authoritarian populism continue to be the strongest forces in the Democratic and Republican parties.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions coming in. I can get to those, start throwing those at you in a second. I want to ask one other thing that stems from the system, the book that you came out with this year. The core thought in the system is that we're in a struggle for the soul of that the struggle for the soul of the country right now is not Democrats versus Republicans, but oligarchy versus democracy. And I was hoping you could just talk about that a little bit, because I suspect that most Americans couldn't really define an oligarch, and they hardly ever hear it except unless the word Russian is right in front of it. So, I mean, could you maybe just talk about this struggle that you're seeing right now?
Yes, I mean, oligarchy is a good old Greek term referring to a form of society, really, not only government, but also economics, in which a relatively small number of people and families dominate the economy and dominate the governing system. Russia is probably the best example we have today, but I think the United States is moving toward that same oligarchic system, given the very, very close connection between wealth and political power. Donald Trump ran in 2016 as a kind of tribune of the working class, but obviously he was a kind of stalking horse or Trojan horse, if you want to go back to ancient history, for the oligarchy in terms of tax breaks and regulatory rollbacks and the most business-friendly Supreme Court since the early 1930s. That's a hard act to maintain, and I think he failed to maintain it. But he was put out of office largely because of the pandemic. I mean, the underlying reality is still very much there. I think Joe Biden is going to have a hard time trying to find middle ground if he thinks that middle ground is the old middle ground between the left and the right, as we used to define it 40 years ago. No, right now, the real underlying contest in the United States is between the bottom 90% that continues to go nowhere, and the top 1% that owns half of the stock market. And actually, the billionaires are doing better than ever. Billionaires have made great strides in this pandemic.
Now, in the book, in the system, the book is kind of like essentially a long meditation on Jamie Dimon, who you hold up as kind of exemplifying all the oligarchs out there. So can you just tell me a little bit why Jamie Dimon, who is he, and he's and what do you think readers can learn by understanding who he is and how he operates?
Well, Jamie Dimon is the CEO and chairman of J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest bank in the United States, one of the largest banks in America. And also, he is the chairman of the Business Roundtable, a Washington lobbying group. It wouldn't really characterize itself as a lobbying group, but it's composed of the CEOs of 192 of the largest companies in America. And it's a powerhouse behind the scenes. I chose Jamie Dimon because he calls himself a Democrat, capital D. He is a major funder for the Democrats. He's a major supporter of the Democratic Party. And I wanted to illustrate the point that this is not about Democrats versus Republicans. And it really is not about evil people. I think he's as I make very clear, or try to make very clear in the book, he's a good guy. I think his values are on the right side. He's tried to do good things in America. He believes in corporate social responsibility. My point is that it's not a matter of villains. It's not a matter of bad people. It's not a matter of Democrats versus Republicans. It's the system. That's why I called the book The System. We have to understand the system as a system, the incentives that are working on everyone like Jamie Dimon, and we've got to change the structure of that system. For example, we've got to, and if the Democrats fail to do this, that is capital D Democrats fail to do this, I think that we're probably looking at a third party eventually in the next 10 or 15 years. We've got to have a countervailing power to the oligarchics' power. We've got to, in this country, if the bottom 90% are going to really have a fair shot at making it, we've got to change the structure of the economy. The market as we now have it, and this is another very central theme of the book, Chris, is not neutral. It's not as if the market is found in a state of nature. The market is a human creation. And the market today, the so-called free market, looks very different in the United States from what it looked like 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. Look at bankruptcy law, look at labor, look at antitrust, look at almost any area of the law, and you see fundamental changes that have been made because people with a great deal of wealth and power and big corporations and financial institutions have made those changes. And those changes work to their betterment, but have not helped. In fact, in many cases have hurt average working people.
So, and Jamie Dimon, either during or before or during the process of reporting and writing this book, called you back. You've been writing or talking some trash about him out there. How was that conversation?
I've never talked. Did you say talk trash about him? No,
sorry,
I've never
exaggerating
that. No, I think I may have criticized him publicly, and he called me. And he spent about 20 minutes just defending himself and was angry. And I was silent, and I finally said, "Are you finished?" And he said yes. And then I essentially made many of the arguments I make in the book, that it was nothing personal. I really am concerned about the structure of the economy, and I think that a lot of what he thinks he's doing with regard to corporate social responsibility and the Business Roundtable statement of a year ago, last August, of corporate social responsibility is absolutely well, it's a fraud. It's not real. It's public relations, whether he and they know it or not.
Okay, so let's get to some questions. So the questions will be coming on all sorts of different topics. The first is dealing with COVID. This is from Deborah Berry, a reporter at USA Today. What is the long-term economic impact of COVID on communities of color, and do the congressional proposals go far enough to make much of a difference for them?
Well, I think the long-term problems are going to be very severe. One of the reasons that communities of color have taken such a bad hit in COVID is that there were already a lot of pre-existing health conditions and social conditions that made them particularly vulnerable. And that gets back to systemic racism. They are set back even further by COVID. They are disproportionately in essential jobs, for example. They are disproportionately in places where COVID has hit very badly. They are disproportionately, if they are not essential workers, they are unemployed and they're not getting any benefits, any federal benefits, which means they are disproportionately being evicted right now. But you see, they don't have much voice. And this is something else that it is important that we talk about, because with great wealth and great concentrated power comes a great deal of voice. But the stories of people of color and the stories of low wage white people, working class white people, the stories of people who are being affected now by COVID, either directly in terms of its health impacts or indirectly in terms of its economic impacts, are not being told. And I think that's a huge problem for our society right now. We're getting to the end of, in December 31st, the limited federal aid we have. And I want to stress that is a problem not only for individuals and very vulnerable individuals, that's also a huge problem for the country, because that means we're not going to have adequate aggregate demand to get us through the next 6 months or a year.
Okay, so let's take an audio question. We have Andrea Fiano of Global Finance Magazine in New York. We'll get you unmuted, and Andrea, the floor is yours.
Yes, Professor is Andrea, but
Andrea, sorry.
Yeah. I would like to go back for 1 second on the non-college whites that you spoke about. You mentioned it a few times. Why then their support political support goes to the more populist, if not worst, voices in American politics? It's not so rational and logic. Why would they support that part? And even if we go back to the last map, very interesting map you were showing about the concentration of votes, 70% versus 30%. It's not, is there a logic to this?
Andrea, there is a logic of sorts, and it's a very old logic, and it's a logic of demagoguery. And let me just get into that for a moment. One thing that when people feel very vulnerable and they feel that they are not getting ahead and they are angry and frustrated, one thing they do is they look to people to represent them who are going to shake things up, who are anti-establishment. Those people, those demagogues, if you will, those leaders like Donald Trump, very often channel that anger, that rage, that anxiety, that frustration to targets that are essentially scapegoats. With Donald Trump's case, it was immigrants, Muslims, Black people, Black athletes, other Black people, Latinos, socialists, coastal elites. But that channeling towards scapegoats is not new under the sun. We have seen demagogues do this repeatedly with regard to populations that feel that they have been somehow mistreated or they are economically under a great deal of pressure. That's the logic. It's not logic in terms of rational. It's logic in terms of that's what happens to these populations. What about the oligarchs or the people at the very top? Well, what I'm about to say is may sound quite controversial. I don't mean it to be. This is based in history. What oligarchies do, what very, very wealthy people do who have benefited from changes, structural changes in an economy, who have exercised their political power to benefit even more. What they often do is, if not actually foment, then at least not protest when a population is split, when people are angry with each other. The divisiveness in the United States right now prevents the government, and it will prevent the government of Joe Biden from doing much about widening inequality. As long as the Republicans stay in power in the Senate, Joe Biden will not be able to do much with regard to any of the things that he has suggested. This is what the oligarchy wants. It not only wants divided government, but it wants a divided public.
Okay. So I have a question here from Jill Sheraton. She is from WFYI in Indianapolis. Professor, can you give some thoughts on how an American culture of individualism factors into systemic inequality?
It factors into systemic inequality in the following way, and it's a good question. Between roughly 1929 and the mid or late 1970s, the United States began moving away from inequality. And I think that one reason we began moving away from inequality is because the New Deal and the Second World War, and then the post-World War II policies in the United States, huge investments in education and job training and infrastructure, followed by major changes, civil rights laws, the Civil Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act. All of that was premised on a degree of social solidarity. That social solidarity came out of a shared experience of depression and World War II. That social solidarity was, in a sense, a unique and uniquely different period in American history. If you go back to Tocqueville in the 1830s, he saw in the United States a degree of individualism he had not seen in Europe. He understood that communities came together for, raising barns and for quilting bees and so on, but he did not see a political capacity for social solidarity, and I think he was right. And so you are right in the implication to your question, and the implication is if we go back to our normal state of individualism, it's going to be harder and harder for us to do much about this. But I want to just add one additional thing. That state of individualism assumes that those at the top are not taking advantage of that individualism to further enrich themselves. But we do have, in a way, socialism at the top. We have bailouts for the biggest banks. We now have bailouts for the biggest corporations led by the Fed. We have people who have been CEOs who have led their companies into terrible losses, who end up with very generous golden parachutes. In other words, we have a system in which those who are very, very wealthy actually are not accountable and are living in a way that is counter to American individualism.
Okay, so now I have a question from Bridget Bergen is from New York Public Radio. To what extent can the drivers of inequality be addressed through local public policy solutions? She's a reporter in New York City with a focus on the upcoming mayoral race. Combating inequality was central to our outgoing Mayor Bill de Blasio's platform. He was talking about it in a post-Bloomberg era. Now that the city faces a $9 billion annual budget gap, in large part because of COVID-19, are there localities that you think are addressing issues of inequality effectively, or can this only be addressed through national policy changes?
It's extremely difficult for localities to address any of this. I mean, yes, localities and states can raise the minimum wage. They can have their own earned income tax credit systems. They can provide some housing relief, as Bill de Blasio did, but it really is very, very tiny compared to what the federal government can do. Remember, most states, for example, by their state constitutions cannot run deficits. The federal government obviously can. Right now, states and localities across America are in very, very bad financial shape. They can't do anything. And that's why they're waiting for the federal government to act.
Okay. So I have a question here from Peter Lowy, who is a reporter from Japan's largest newspaper, Asahi Shimbun. His question is, many people, myself included, voted not for Joe Biden, but against Donald Trump. What do you say to an incoming capital D Democratic administration that represents exactly that establishment system and has shown no interest in changing anything? And to your third party comment, how do you get those Democrats to acknowledge the support that the left gave them?
I think Joe Biden is, as you suggested, very much a president-elect who is there because it was the 2020 election was a referendum on Trump, and Trump lost that referendum. Now, I think your question is, can or will Biden do much to overcome some of the deep structural problems that we've been talking about this afternoon? If he had the Senate, if the Democrats, for example, won the elections in Georgia on January 5th, and there was a 50-50 split and Kamala Harris had the deciding vote, then I think Joe Biden would probably be bolder than Barack Obama. I think Joe Biden, from what I know of him, and I know a lot of the people around him, has come a long way toward understanding, as I said before, that the center is not just between left and right as we used to know it, but it's something more profound, and it has a lot more to do with resources and power and wealth. But having said that, I don't think that the Democratic Party as a party yet has fully come to grips with the fact that it has deserted or abandoned the American working class over the past 40 years, that we are dealing with a 40-year or 45-year change that is as dramatic and profound as we actually are. And if the Democrats don't take this on in a way that is proportional to its urgency, then I think as I said, I think we will have a third party.
Okay, we have a question that kind of touches on the working class and their relative economic strength over the last few decades. Is from Kirsten Pochop of the Idaho Center for Fiscal Policy. Can you please provide more explanation of the mechanics behind why relative wages have been falling since the 1980s? How much was the decline of labor unions coupled with Reagan era policies and the rise of women in the workforce?
Well, I'd say that roughly 25% has been technological change. That is the substitution of routine work with robotics and eventually the internet and artificial intelligence to come. Another 25%, maybe 30% has been globalization. The increasing ease with which companies can outsource to lower wage, lower cost production systems abroad. But that still leaves at least 45% of the question. I think that the decline of labor unions is a big piece of it. There's a chart that I was thinking about using, but I did not use, but it shows an almost direct correlation between the rise of labor unions in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, and the decline of inequality in the United States, and then the decline of labor unions and the rise of inequality. Labor unions, what they really did is in the 1950s and 60s, give American workers a countervailing power, a real voice. Now, beyond all of that, I think there is also another factor. And I think that this is the X factor. Why is it in the United States we have the degree of inequality we have that we don't have in other nations? I think it has to do with money in politics, wealth in politics, the degree to which big money can influence political outcomes in America, and it can't quite have that degree of influence in other advanced nations.
Okay, so question from Peggy O'Mara, who is a writer and editor in Fort Collins, Colorado. One of the results of income inequality is an increase in poverty and hunger, and many of those who care, and as well as many of those who care for others, many of those who care for others live in poverty. What is your opinion of the American Family Act, which provides a fully refundable tax credit of $3,000 to $3,600 a year per child? A one-year version of the AFA was included in the HEROES Act. And according to a report from the Century Foundation, a child allowance would reduce child poverty by 42% and reduce poverty among Black children by more than half. So your thoughts on the American Family Act and its refundable child tax credit?
Well, I'm all in favor. I think it's a very important initiative. My only caution is that refundable tax credits do depend on there being a full-time worker in the household. And when we are dealing with periods like we're in now, where we have very high unemployment, particularly among people of color, we can't rely solely or even to a large extent on refundable tax credits. Even the earned income tax credit or the child tax credit, all of these tax credits are very important. They are the largest anti-poverty programs we have in the United States, but they all depend on people working. I worry not only in the short term about the depth of this COVID-related recession, but I worry in the long term as well about the availability of jobs as artificial intelligence takes over more and more of our work.
Okay. Question from Jerry Mitchell, who is from the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting. Those living in Mississippi's poorest counties are dying from COVID-19 at more than 3 times the rate of those living in counties where citizens earn $25,000 or more. You mentioned the pre-existing health conditions that cause the poor to be disproportionately affected. What can be done to improve this situation in states like Mississippi, which has repeatedly rejected the expansion of Medicaid and has also seen the closings of rural hospitals?
Look, Mississippi is an interesting case in the sense that if poor people in Mississippi, not just Black people, but poor people, I'm talking about the bottom 50% of Mississippians got together, they would have much more political power than they now have. I was surprised and saddened, for example, that Mike Espy was not elected to the Senate from Mississippi, not because Mike Espy is Black, but because Mike Espy understands the problems of white and Black Mississippians. You can't, racism is dividing people who should be together. Medicaid, it's absurd that Medicaid is not expanded in Mississippi or other states where it hasn't been expanded under the Affordable Care Act. I mean, the federal government is picking up all the expenses, will pick up 90% of the expenses. We know that COVID is having it's ravaging many of these poor communities. And again, they're not just Black communities, they're not just Latino communities, they're poor white communities as well. This is a matter of Democrats and a matter of community organizers educating poor and middle working class white people that they are in the same boat as poor and working class Black and Latino people. Okay.
So we have time for a few more questions. If you want to get a question in, raise your hand or submit it via the Q&A text function. I have a question here from Donald Mitchell. It's kind of about how the debate is articulated or labeled or described. Mr. Reich, you mentioned that the issue is not necessarily good or bad people, but the system and the people benefit by acting in line with the rules making up that system. The system in this case seems to be our version of capitalism. If you subscribe to the argument that the system is our brand of capitalism, how do we change the system and not have it labeled as a move towards socialism?
Well, the label socialism has been used by opponents of government action since 1932 was the first time I saw, not personally, I was not around, but I saw and I've read the socialist label. They accused Franklin D. Roosevelt when he came up with Social Security of being a socialist. Harry Truman said socialism is the word they use when they don't want schools and highways and everything else. I mean, look, there are going to be labels that are used. I think the narrative, though, that Democrats, capital D, progressives, but also anybody who is reasonable and who looks at the mixed economy that we have needs to use is public investment and safety nets. It's not capitalism versus socialism. There's not a country around the world that even China has private property and free exchange of goods and services. I mean, you can't find an instance of communism around the world. And even the Nordic countries are capitalistic countries in terms of private property and exchange of goods and services. But the difference between one form, that is the American form of capitalism, and say the Nordic form of capitalism has to do with the extent of public investment in education, job training, social health services. I mean, that is public health and also infrastructure and safety nets that people need. It may be that after COVID, the American public is sufficiently, sadly, tragically traumatized that we come together around public health. We come together around issues of stopping the degradation of the environment. We understand that we're all in this together. Maybe the legacy of what we've been through is similar or will be similar to the legacy of the 1930s and Second World War and the first decades after the Second World War. I hope so.
Okay. So we have a question, audio question from Chris Waljasper. Tyler, if you could unmute Chris. Chris is a former fellow of ours. So welcome, Chris, and the floor is yours. I think the floor is yours.
Unmute. There we go. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hey. Yeah, Robert, can you speak more about the what you see as the future impacts of this inequality on rural America, whether it be economically or kind of the outlook of rural working class Americans, as we move into the future?
Chris, spatial or geographic inequality is one of the major attributes, aspects of the inequality that we are experiencing. Rural America has been emptying out for years. I think it's very important that the leading industries of the country, and I'm talking about primarily high technology, begin moving into rural America. You don't need to have vast agglomerations of people in order to have a high technology business, as we are now experiencing directly as I speak. We can do so much more remotely than we could before. So I think that with some incentives, maybe some federal and state incentives, it will be possible for high technology to be more widely dispersed around the country, creating not just jobs, but good jobs, creating some incentives for people in rural America who to get a college education, young people, and if they do have a college education, to stay in rural America rather than to move to the coasts.
That's wonderful. Thank you.
All right. So time for just a couple of more. I have one here from Heather Painter, who works for the U.S. House. Not sure who she works for, but you mentioned that the Biden administration without the Senate cannot make significant progress on many economic opportunity policies. Are there some that you think they could tackle through executive orders, and which do you think should be the focus, if so?
Yes, I think that the Biden administration could certainly reverse the Trump executive orders as they affect the inequalities we've been talking about. And again, I want to make explicit that we've been talking about not only economic inequalities, but also environmental inequalities, inequalities that affect Americans in terms of even race and politics. All of this could be reversed by the Biden administration, as they say, on day one. In terms of regulations, the Labor Department under Secretary Scalia has been a very regressive force. It hasn't got nearly the attention it deserves, but it has hurt working people in quite dramatic ways. And I think that by both executive order and also changes in regulations, those sorts of harms can be negated. The question is, how much could a Biden administration, through regulation and executive order, move beyond where we were pre-Trump, where we were in the last months of the Obama administration? Well, that is going to depend to some extent on the federal courts, because how far a president can go with executive orders and regulations is a legal matter. And there is the story of Mitch McConnell. Mitch McConnell has spent much of his time over the past, really not just 4 years, but really during the Obama administration as well, trying to shape the federal court system into a system that is quite different than it was in terms of how it looks at these issues of power. The great irony is that the people that McConnell has put on the federal courts tend to take a very expansive view of executive power. And that's not necessarily good for democracy, small d, but it could be very good for the Biden administration in terms of executive orders and regulations.
Okay, so it's 2 o'clock right now. We'll go a couple minutes past 2. I have 3 more questions, 1 dealing with a tech issue and 2 dealing with journalism practices. Tech question comes from Joshua McNichols, a reporter at KUOW, the NPR affiliate in Seattle. On the whole, have tech companies' innovations increased the amount of wealth in the economy, or merely redistributed that money, with the lion's share now falling to tech elites?
I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of Americans are probably better off in the sense of efficiency. The efficiency with which, for example, we can order and get goods delivered from Amazon, or communicate right now over Zoom, or have the benefits of Google searches and so on. But um, having said that, I think it's important to know that these large agglomerations of power also have had some very, very obvious negative effects, ranging from the decline of privacy to the effect on employees of those companies and indirectly of a lot of other people who are contractors to those companies. My personal example is I am an author. I've written a lot of books. I am probably, according to a number of studies, getting far less remuneration from my books than I used to get because Amazon has a monopoly on distributing books. Well, where is my money going? It's going to Amazon, and some of it's going to Jeff Bezos. So from the standpoint of the distributional consequences of these huge high technology firms, it's very much a mixed bag.
And I guess I should point out, for full disclosure, that my copy of this came to me from Amazon last week. So a question from Christopher Connolly, who is from KERA News in Dallas. Do you have ideas for what is missing from local journalism, or ideas on what you think local journalists can do that would help people understand how inequality impacts local communities? It's a challenge to keep that in the frame for the kinds of relatively short, quick hit storytelling that is the bread and butter of what local reporters are expected to do. So any thoughts for what local journalists can do to kind of address and help explain inequality to their viewers?
Yes, I think it's important to connect up the economics and the politics. In every locale, for example, there are issues that people are anxious about, like, well, here in Berkeley, housing, many other communities as well. What is happening with regard to housing? Well, you have developers that are taking advantage of the lack of affordable housing to squeeze from local cities all sorts of benefits without actually adding very much to the stock of low-income housing. That's a big story, and it's a story of power and exploitation and wealth and politics. And it can be told from many, many directions on many, many issues. I mentioned in passing Proposition 22 in California. Lyft and also Uber are going now town to town, city to city, state to state, to try to make sure that their employees will be classified as independent contractors. This harms their workers, it harms all workers, because as more and more employees are classified as independent contractors, they lose all of the labor protections of the last 100 years.
Okay, and final question for me, also on journalism practices, both in the system and the book The System, and in the Inequality for All documentary. There's lots of reporting by you talking with workers out there in the country. Do you get a sense that journalism, mainstream journalism, is doing that enough? Are we going out and talking with workers and really understanding what they're going through, or are we not? Are we too dependent on kind of official sources and think tanks and things like that?
Look, Chris, one of my biggest concerns, and I'm sure it's the National Press Foundation's concern as well, is that we are seeing really, the word is used too much, but I'm going to use the word crisis in terms of small papers, newspapers, journalism around the country. There is so much consolidation. There is so much loss in newsrooms around America. We have more corporate public relations professionals now than we do have journalists. That is a huge loss. And it's not just a loss with regard to journalists talking to workers in any locale. It's a loss that's more profound. It has to do with really the kind of themes that I've been talking about. We've been talking about the last hour. Power, where power is lodged, the relationship between wealth and power. I would love it if we have to do more journalism online, so be it. But there ought to be a larger role for local journalism online that pays for itself, or where there are ways of paying for that. So you get high quality investigative journalism that is locally based. We need it, we're losing it. It is critical to our democracy.